Welcome to Why Like Ike. I'm Dennis Weiss. I am happy to host you today. I have a couple of friends with me, Pam Sanfilippo, Tim Reeves, and we are here to talk about
President's Day.
President's Day, aka Washington's birthday, right? And we're gonna remove the mystery behind the name. Man behind the curtain's going to do all that. So Pam's going to do
the
most
Pam
of the
behind the
real
curtain
work.
is going to do most of it.
So we have two beautiful portraits out here, Pam, in front of us. Lincoln, Washington. I'll start out by saying great leaders always look to past leaders for inspiration, and Dwight David Eisenhower certainly was no exception to that rule. These are two of his many most admired people.
Yes, and these are two portraits that he painted himself from earlier portraits. I think the Washington one was
The Gilbert Stewart famous painting, unfinished at the bottom as Ike left his too.
Oh, very cool. I didn't know that.
And he, in 1954, painted that and then had Hallmark make prints of it for Christmas cards as gifts or prints for his staff in the White House.
Very cool.
And then in 53, the year before, he had done the Lincoln one as gifts to his staff.
Well, that shows, I guess, passing down through his subordinates, a view of what he cared about.
What he valued,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, very. Okay, get us started. You're the lady with the facts today.
Well, a little bit of the history of Washington's birthday and how it became President's Day for us today. Washington's birthday became a federal holiday in Washington, D.C. in 1879, so quite early. In 1885, that was extended to all federal employees. And it wasn't until 1968 that the Uniform Monday Holiday Act changed celebrating Washington's birthday on his actual birthday, February 22nd, to the Monday Holiday Act. They kept it as Washington's birthday, but by the 1980s, we started referring to it as President's Day.
Okay.
So officially, it's still called Washington's birthday.
That's interesting because as I grew up, it was always Washington's birthday in school, so that's...
And Lincoln's birthday, we had both dates off.
Did you?
We did.
Well, you're a privileged person. Where did you go to school?
In Kansas.
Well, I tell you, I went to school in Colorado. We got hunting season off, though.
And
That's
in Missouri,
always good.
we didn't get Lincoln's birthday, but I know Illinois did.
Two great presidents flanking us here. Great president behind us, all over at the whiteboard behind us. And
Well, I
that's
do have
what
a
we're
story
here to
about
talk
Eisenhower, which I related to Pam this morning. I was in 5th grade when he died and living here in Kansas, and we were out of school the day of his funeral. And I was disappointed the next year because I thought it was going to become an annual holiday. But it was just a one-off.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you have memory of what you did that day?
Probably nothing to commemorate General Eisenhower,
Okay,
President
all right.
Eisenhower, other than thank him for a day out of school.
Yeah, a day out of
Yeah.
school. Well, that's worth thanking for.
And we
Get
know
us back on track, Pam.
Sure. We know that Eisenhower admired Washington from an early age. He talks in At Ease that he loved history, we know that, and that Washington was his American hero. He says for his stamina and patience in adversity, his courage, daring, and capacity for self-sacrifice. And he had read his farewell speech. We know that when Ike left office, he kind of modeled his farewell speech after Washington's.
Interesting.
And they're the two most famous farewell addresses in history.
Yeah. The Washington has really left most people's conversations about presidents, on the street. People don't have too many coffee shop conversations about Washington anymore. I think about, I went to school, born in 57, so went to school through the 60s and 70s, and we spent a lot of time in class talking about these two presidents flanking us here, and especially Washington.
We did too. In fact, in every classroom through my grade school years, we had that Gilbert Stewart reproduction of that painting in the classroom. And I doubt you could find one today.
Yeah. A lot of lessons to be learned in the past, which is why we make Why Like Ike. It gives us a reason to expand beyond Eisenhower into the men Eisenhower admired in his predecessor.
One of the items we have here in our collection, Tim, you can probably address it a little more, is a piece that was given to Eisenhower in 1953 that was something owned by George Washington. So others knew of Ike's admiration for Washington.
That's amazing,
as well.
and we got a quick brief before the show started, right? But it's a tool in a game, a piece of a game.
That's right. A game which I know nothing about.
Okay. Well, it was a precursor to cribbage, somebody said. So, but I see little tiny holes around this mother of pearl in the middle. Must have been some sort of accounting
That's my
artifact, I would think. It's tiny, it's beautiful, and it's here. And on the back, something you know something about, a wax George Washington family seal. Don't see that on stamps nowadays, Tim.
You do not, or documents.
Right. Very special things here at the library, museum. Great opportunity to talk about them.
Well, Eisenhower loved to play card games and other games, loved to match his wits against an opponent, whether it was in bridge or earlier poker, or even a game of Scrabble with Mamie. And so this really would appeal to him on a couple of levels.
Yeah. Okay, Pam, what is our next topic of discussion about President's Day and Eisenhower?
Well, we know that in 1953, he initiated a proclamation declaring the week of June 14th, Theodore Roosevelt Week,
Another man
he greatly
admired.
admired. Mm-hmm. So that was when the dedication of his home, Roosevelt's home at Sagamore Hill, became part of the National Park Service, and so they paid tribute to his memory that week.
Curveball coming.
Okay.
Mr. Eisenhower's other farm is where?
Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. You can tell us the history of why that is there, but what I find significant about today's discussion, Gettysburg is indelibly linked to Mr. Lincoln, and I noticed in some of the proclamations that you had specifically about Lincoln, was he quoted of, by, and for the people, and those words carry great weight with Dwight David Eisenhower.
Well, it's interesting. Of course, he admired Washington for the attributes that we talked about a moment ago, but he really looked to Lincoln as a political model. And he saw Lincoln as an exemplar of the middle way that he talked about so frequently as president, and that Lincoln was often navigating his way between extremists, both in the military as commander-in-chief and politically. And so he really did look to Lincoln more for almost practical reasons, as well as being a great admirer. And then, of course, winds up living at Gettysburg, which coincidentally, or perhaps not, the Eisenhower family was from that area before they came to Kansas. Then, of course, he was there commanding the Tank Center during World War I at Camp Colt. Then his love of Civil War history. So it was really, obviously, a big draw to Ike to live at Gettysburg.
It's an interesting thing. If we were sitting here talking about your family or Pam's family or my family, the places and stories would change a little, but the overall theme would not. People, when they retire, generally pick something of significance to relate to, and Eisenhower picked Gettysburg.
He did, for all the reasons we discussed, and also its proximity to Washington, and so for a number of reasons, but I think largely sentimental reasons. And
I would think so. Were it me, sentimental always overcomes proximity to Washington. Just saying.
Well, he was very practical.
Well, I'm pretty practical too, but there are benefits to distance as well as proximity.
Well, and probably during his time at West Point, he toured the battlefields at Gettysburg as well. There were always those.
I have to imagine it was fascinating to him, all joking aside, who he was as a person. I think Gettysburg, the whole area, had to be fascinating.
And facing the same decisions those commanders faced.
Right.
And also another great hero of his, who was not a president, was Robert E. Lee.
Right.
and was one of 4 portraits on the wall of the Oval Office when he was president.
Yeah, well, if you're talking military men, one of the most admired military leaders
Exactly.
that ever was born in our country. And they were all contemporaries. The people who fought on both sides of the war at that level, they were contemporaries. They were served in the same units.
Had
many
gone to
times.
West Point together before
That's
the war,
right.
so it was
Yeah.
a different situation, but he did admire Lee.
Eisenhower gives us such a great opportunity to think about things. So it's President's Day. Many people watching, it's a holiday, day off work, day off school, something. But our task here today is to remind people that it's President's Day because a proclamation was written a long time ago, Washington's birthday, and it's still a federal holiday today as President's Day. But to Dwight David Eisenhower, there is a personal connection of admiration, of looking to these 2 men to learn from as examples. And again, we're at a presidential library.
Right, and that's part of our mission, is to promote presidential history.
Right.
And Eisenhower was a great admirer of the institution as well, and really believed in a separation of powers. So the presidency for him, was really a matter of, the American experience in democracy.
So Pam, I know you work with young people here at the library from time to time, and I think about our topic today, and if you were to be thrust out in front of the sophomores again as they come in for their research project, and one of them was Lincoln and then George Washington as it relates to, what would they find in our holdings here from Eisenhower Library that relates back to these 2 presidents?
Well, some of the items we have on display here, and then I think just using Eisenhower's time in office as a reflection of the office of the president and how we take President's Day today as a way to honor that office more than anything. And for the United States, I think it's fascinating that from George Washington on, our military leaders aren't the ones that, we don't have a dictatorship or a
Right.
military leader. It's a civilian office, and Ike fits in both of those categories, as did Washington, and I think that's a very interesting difference between us and a lot of other countries.
That's a great point of view. Eisenhower, great military leader, but he wasn't elected as a military leader. He was elected as a civilian to the office of president. Every time we sit and do a Why Like Ike, and no matter what the topic is, whether it's this or Mamie's hats and shoes, or whether it's an SG-44, the real topic of conversation is the benefit to society by the holdings and the museum here through where the world can look at the world through Dwight David Eisenhower's eyes. What unparalleled opportunity of value statement that is for Abilene, Kansas, Kansas itself, United States of America, and the world.
And that's the idea behind it. One other president we could mention, whom I greatly admired, was Theodore Roosevelt.
Yes.
And although he doesn't mention him and say his memoirs the way he does Lincoln and Washington, in a lot of his correspondence, especially after his presidency, he talks about his admiration as a boy for Theodore Roosevelt. And you could see why Theodore Roosevelt would appeal to a boy's imagination.
Sure. I think of Theodore Roosevelt as one of the early presidents who had a dang good PR department. Did he not?
Mostly himself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, but he was out telling the story about himself he wanted told.
Well, that's right. He wrote many, many books.
Whether it was the charge up San Juan Hill or the national parks, the preservation of public lands, all of those
His
things that he
cowboy
was
days.
passionate about,
Yeah.
he was not shy about telling people. We live in the iPhone world today, right? You can learn anything you want to know by wiggling your thumbs. Not so much in those days. So as Dwight David Eisenhower, as a little boy, his learning may have happened with a book. That was the most easily accessible media he had. But Teddy Roosevelt was prominent in the literature of
very
the
much
time
so.
that Eisenhower grew up.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And certainly his motto, speak softly and carry a big stick, kind of became, in little different form, Ike's motto.
We talked about that in our town this morning at the director's office, and I thought of that myself. Isn't that interesting? Sat on his desk for a long time.
Correct.
And again, it's interesting that all three of those presidents he admired, you can see it reflected in his presidency, whether it's Washington's farewell address or his admiration of Lincoln's governing style, or Theodore Roosevelt coming back from his childhood to appear in that motto. And so he really did take lessons from these leaders he admired.
So if we have to be closing in on the end of the program, and I want to pull from you your opinion. All three of these people, Lincoln, Washington, Eisenhower, that we're here to talk about today, are world renowned for making great speeches, several of them, not just one. So it's a short attention span world. If somebody were interested in finding Lincoln's best speech, which one is that, Tim?
I think most people would agree it's Gettysburg,
Pam?
which isn't very long.
Yes.
I
No.
would agree. I would agree.
Right.
Washington?
The farewell address, but I don't know the length of it.
Yeah, I would agree. Farewell address is so broad in it. It's reach into the heart of the American consciousness of the time. It's still so relevant today. You could stand up in any history class and read that speech, and people would learn and listen. Okay, now the topic at hand, Mr. Eisenhower.
Well, I think as president, it's got to be the farewell address and the famous warning of the military-industrial complex. But as general, there would be some choices too.
Yeah.
Well, and I would argue that his speech to the nation at Little Rock
Yep.
in 1957 is one that touches many people on various levels. But his desire to say we've got to be a nation of law, not of mob violence.
And some scholars would probably point to the Atoms for Peace as well at the UN in 1953, or Chants for Peace after Premier Stalin died. So Eisenhower really does have a lot to,
He does
to
have a
choose
lot
from.
to draw from. The one thing I want to link together, I guess, is I think many times when we look at these three people, incredible pressure drives the president to a podium to make a great speech. It's not just a great speech. It is incredible pressure that has driven them to this platform to say the words they say. If you look at Mr. Lincoln, Mr. Washington, and Mr. Eisenhower as presidents of our country, incredible periods of time for each, hopefully unparalleled. I don't know that I would want a more interesting time in the future than we've had.
That it takes, as you say, to make that kind of speech.
To make that kind of speech, the pressures that drive them into them, but how outstanding it is that our country has been able to produce just in this small sample, these three great leaders that we have in front of us today, Mr. Lincoln, Mr. Washington, and Mr. Eisenhower.
Absolutely.
And we can claim Mr. Eisenhower, hometown right here in Abilene, Kansas.
And the other two pieces, whereas we know Eisenhower admired these former presidents, people of his time, we have a couple of examples from 1954, who compared Ike to some of his predecessors, just as we're doing today, but these pieces, Abe and Ike on this one, and then pictures of Eisenhower and Lincoln on the other one.
Well, as we finish out the program today, a stirring reminder of the benefits of having the Eisenhower Presidential Library here in Abilene, Kansas, here in America, open to the world. The great things that you can come find, the artifacts that reflect the words, the thoughts, the actions of the man that we represent today, Dwight David Eisenhower. We sure appreciate you watching Like Ike. We're confident you learned something from these two today. I hope you had a great time. I'm Dennis Weiss, wishing you a great day.